And I went to go to the doctor. They do their assessment, and she said, Stacy, I think you have depression. Like, you're really struggling with, you've got all the signs and symptoms. I think you've got depression. I lost it. And I remember saying to her, I can't be depressed. Christians are not depressed. Hi, I'm Stacy.
And hi, I'm John.
And this is God in the Gray, a place where we have conversations around spirituality, culture, religion, and all of the gray areas concerning where God shows up, because not everything is black and white. Today, we are actually going to have a conversation about mental health and the church. Should be really simple, right? So before we actually get started, if you have any questions, if you are struggling with mental health yourself, please see the show notes. We have resources for you to reach out, and we would love any questions that you want to send us. So, mental health in the church. Easy peasy. It's a nuanced conversation. It has a lot of ups and downs in it, but why in the world would, when we look around at the churches today, in America especially, and what they're navigating, and how Christians often treat those with mental illness, which can be anything from anxiety and depression to bipolar to multi-personalities. It's not a kind place often to be in the church and have mental illness. What do you say to that? Why would I want to be a part of a church if I struggle with mental illness?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, and there's, so I'll name a name because this has been out in the ether. A pastor named John MacArthur not long ago essentially said that mental illness doesn't exist. Mm. And so there are certainly those in some segments of the church that that not only are non-inclusive to those with mental health issues, they just flat out deny it. Mm-hmm. And like, I mean, I would just start with just a voice of empathy. Like, if you're struggling with mental health issues and you've felt Christians in your life, even pastors, leaders, kind of deny or diminish those struggles, like, man, I'm so sorry. Like, that is extremely challenging. And that's just not at all actually what the Bible's view and vision of mental health is. Like, there's actually, I would say, a huge place for navigating mental health in the context of Christianity and in the context of the church. It's like you look through the cast of characters in the Bible, you have a lot of those who are not doing well. You flip open to Lamentations, which traditionally we ascribe to Jeremiah, but it might be a different prophet. You look at, like, there's intense, deep, like, I'm very comfortable using this word, depression in that book, a soul struggle. Look at Job. Like, you may identify with Job's struggles. Even you may even identify with kind of these relationships that he has with his friends who seem, you know, like they're okay with him being uncomfortable and dark for a period of time, but then they're like, okay, Job, like we're past the time, and so let's start feeling better. Let's start being happier. Let's be okay. You look at David. His deep, dark seasons of lament and crying out to God. And I would argue that actually sometimes the deepest mark of faith is navigating through the darkest night of your soul. Mm. And actually, if you pull back in the church's tradition, you meet many people, many mystics in the church's tradition who navigate these spaces, and they are not actually pulled away from their faith, but they're pulled deeper into faith as a result of their challenges with mental health. Mm. How do you
approach like there, you said John MacArthur spoke this, that mental illness is not real. Some people say psychology or psychiatry is not, certainly not of what a Christian should be walking into. Or how do you approach that? Like if somebody's struggling with mental illness and in the church they come to you, like, but maybe they've had a background where I've not been able to go to see a psychologist or a counselor or anything because there's been this taboo put on it. What do you say to somebody that's struggling with that?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the Bible with science, with counseling, with psychiatry?
Yeah, and there's a tension there for sure, because it's been argued, and I actually think it's a really astute observation that the contemporary priest in our world today, in our secular world, is the counselor, is the therapist. And in fact, if you go back, and you can Google this and look into this, but there's actually early psychologists who say one day the counselor, the therapist, will take the place of the priest. And there's actually, so, as a Christian, as a pastor, I don't want to cede that world to that realm of psychology and psychiatry. And by that I mean as though oh, well, we don't know what to do at all.
Right.
And so that's just oh goodness, we can't handle it. You need the real experts to handle it. And so on the one hand, I don't want to be in that place, because I think that there is the realm and the world and the word of the spiritual realm into the psychological and the psychiatric. On the other hand, the Bible talks about us as embodied beings. We live in our flesh, and as you dig into a theology of the body and embodiment, you recognize that it's God's gift to us that we're embodied beings, and yet also there's consequences. We live in a post-fall state, and by that I mean there's sin from the beginning of the human story that's trickled down to all of us. And so all of us have, as part of our spiritual life, this body, this flesh that we live in. And part of that then is our brain too, right? And there are realities in our body. We could see this through, I'm balding, right? I have age spots showing up on my face and wrinkles. There's those types of realities of aging and my body breaking down on me. There's also, in the same way, there's realities neurologically in terms of brain chemistry. And I don't want to overstate kind of that all of the answers for that are in the realm of psychology and psychiatry. But I also don't want to understate those things, just as I wouldn't want to understate, hey, if you have issues with your body, go to the doctor. If you're struggling with mental health, go seek a professional in that realm. And yet also, here's the phrase that kind of those in my kind of camp, because there's lots of different camps in the Christian world of how to make sense of mental health and the church. I say this, some issues are physiological in terms of mental health. There are some real physiological issues. And by that, I mean hey, you might need to have psychiatric intervention in terms of medication. That's a real thing. But all issues are spiritual. Mm-hmm. And so we are spiritual beings. And so we have to be careful not to bifurcate that too much, to say, hey, this will just be fixed with a pill or with an intervention. But hey, this is something that actually God is inviting me into, a journey he's inviting me on, this struggle. And actually there's lots of places in Scripture that we can navigate and see other people struggling in the same way. And God often seems to invite us into that with a purpose and a desire to have us meet him there. Mm. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if you're struggling with mental health, then you may well need those who have that kind of expertise to deal with the physiological issues in it. But don't miss in that. Whatever your story is on that, God is inviting you to have him be part of that story, be part of that journey.
I'm going to just jump in on that right there, a little bit of my story, and I'm going to ask you a question about that. Many, many years ago, it's probably been 25 years, things were not lining up the way they should for, a late 20s, early 30s. And I went to go to the doctor. They do their assessment, and she said, Stacy, I think you have depression. You're really struggling with, you've got all the signs and symptoms. I think you've got depression. I lost it. And I remember saying to her, I can't be depressed. Christians are not depressed. Because what had been ingrained in my head is if you are praying right, if you are reading the Bible, if you are going to church all the time, you have the joy of the Lord, therefore you should not be depressed. And I lived with that. It took me probably, so I drove from that doctor's appointment to a prayer meeting where the leader of that prayer meeting said, why would you, if you had a heart problem, and they said you had a heart problem, you wouldn't cry, you would take the medicine that they give you. So let's take the medicine that they give you and pray and worship and do the things. The one does not negate the other. But I went through years of that. And to this day, I still take medication for depression and anxiety, but have struggled to off and on, getting off and then starting again and getting off. And I know that it is physiological. I know it is a chemical thing, and yet still struggle with that. Well, you're not praying hard enough. Well, it's spiritual warfare, or, Satan's coming to get you. And so it becomes a shame thing. It becomes I have to fix this, instead of, no, this is an organ in my body that needs help. A broken body in a broken world that needs assistance. And so what do we say to people who are, first of all, who are saying that to others? I think that as leaders, we have a responsibility to say to someone, hey, those aren't the words that you speak to someone that's struggling. But then also to the person who's receiving those words and maybe just can't bring themselves to take a pill. I will say this right now, that little orange pill, everybody should be happy that I'm taking it. But again, it is I've come to a place where I've accepted that as it is not who I am. It's a part of, I take thyroid medication, I take an antidepressant. And Stacy's happy. So what do we say? How do we guide? How do we direct? How do we walk alongside both of those? The person who's speaking those words, but then the person who's receiving those words. Yeah,
let's start with the person who's speaking those words. I think it just depends what our relationship with them is. Obviously, as a pastor in this congregation, I'm going to be shepherding those here and maybe even having some hard conversations with people who might be kind of sharing what's a sub-biblical understanding of kind of what mental health and our spiritual life is. I don't think that it's really healthy for me to be yelling out to the internet to all of the wrong people out there to fix them. And so I take more kind of responsibility within our body. And so I would encourage you, if you're a member of a church and you kind of hear that kind of thing, talk to your pastor about that and try to navigate that in a healthy and a loving way. I would also say that, if you're on the flip side of that and you're hearing that, and again, I hope you hear this from us a lot. We're sorry, we empathize with that. That is absolutely shame-inducing and producing, and that's just so painful. And I can't say it clearly enough. Shame is never from God. Shame is never from God. And so, and what's dangerous about that, back to the first person who's speaking those kinds of things, is you're not actually, what you're doing is you're asking for that person to either stop the intervention or to hide the intervention. And both of those are massive problems, massive problems. The reality is this: we're all struggling spiritually in some way. And yes, that person who's battling mental health issues, like I said, there's spiritual issues at play there. But there's spiritual issues at play for all of us. And I can't say what those are. Only God can. And so if you're on the other side of that, I would say, don't hide. Like I pray that you're seeking out a godly Christian, a biblical counselor who can walk through those things with you. I highly encourage those who have mental health issues. If indeed it's a psychiatric issue, hey, go see a psychiatrist. But also be navigating that through with a wise and a godly Christian counselor, biblical counselor in your life, because you need both. You need both of those, right? Yes, you may well need that pill, but you also need someone to help guide you through the spiritual process of what it is to live with that, right? In the same way that if you were, let's talk about, like, if I experienced a dramatic accident and I was an amputee, right? Like, yes, there's absolutely medical intervention that has to go on through that trauma. But we're embodied beings. That has a massive traumatic and spiritual impact on you as well. So you need to navigate that spiritually as well.
I think just to even piggyback off of what you said, when we don't walk with that wise and spiritual mentor person to walk alongside us, it's just another way of hiding it. And if it stays in the dark, bad things go on in the dark in our minds, and we tell stories that shouldn't be told. As you've navigated, I'm sure lots and lots of relationships and people with you and your wife Angel and counseling, like, what is your perspective on the mental health in the church and how we can, I hesitate to say do better because, I don't want it to be a performance thing, but yeah, how can the church be better? And how do you see that from a counseling perspective in the world that we're in today?
Yeah, I would just I'd pull back to kind of that original comment, which is like, I see those in the Christian world who I think they cede too much territory to the world of psychiatry and psychology. Like, oh, we don't have any answers for that. Like, you just go see the real professionals on that, right? And I would say, like, while that's not stigmatizing, I'm grateful that it's not stigmatizing. It's also not fully biblical. It's not a fully biblical understanding. On the flip side, obviously, even more problematic are those churches that stigmatize it and say, no, you just need to pray harder. There's something wrong with your spiritual life. And to those I would like, oh my goodness, like, open up your Bible and take a look. Look at Elijah. Look at Jeremiah. Look at Jesus. Look at David. These are people with dark. Look at Paul. Paul cries out, Lord, take this thorn from my flesh. We don't know what that is, right? But he is wrestling with, if I could put it in contemporary terms, with mental health, with spiritual health, right? And so, like, I think that there has to be a middle way where we're a community that fully understands the reality of us being embodied and the reality that there are psychiatric issues at play, there are psychological issues at play, and yet in all of those things, we're invited deeper in a spiritual walk with Christ, who bore our suffering, who bore that trauma. Don't miss in the story the agony, the anguish, the dark night of Jesus' soul in the Garden of Gethsemane. Darker than the darkness that we could ever imagine. Christ is right there with you.
Those aren't hollow words. And, so often I think we can brush that off. But the fact is that Christ does know what we've experienced and what we are experiencing. It's been a great conversation. I think that there's far more that we can go into on this, and we will certainly have future episodes on mental health and the church. We hope that wherever you're at with your mental health, or maybe somebody that is walking through some issues, that you are curious and you continue to ask questions, and we would love to answer any of those questions. If you would like to drop us a note, we will leave the resources in the show notes for you, along with a list of phone numbers for you to utilize if you are struggling right now. We thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.